समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The wisdom or the gyan we bring to you today is based on the conversations over 7 years, 3 conversations over 7 years between two very important leaders. Very important leaders. I am shy of saying the two most important leaders in the world because by 2001, when these conversations start, in any case, the Chinese leader would have been among the two most important, and the Chinese leader of that era is not, any of those eras is not here. There is one leader which transcends this entire era of 7 years, 2001 to 8, that's Vladimir Putin. Your guess is as good as mine. And the second in this case is George Bush, who was president. So the first conversation, 2001, was in his first presidency. The second was in his second presidency. In fact, the first one very soon after he was sworn in or he was inaugurated as president, and the last one in 2008 when he was closing out his 2-term presidency. Now the important thing is, look at the way this progresses. Look at the way the conversations progress. There is a bunch of them. These have been declassified. And these have been declassified. These are obviously redacted in some places, but declassified conversations of these 3 meetings, these 3 summits. The first one on June 16, 2001 at Bredo Castle, Slovenia. The second on September 16, 2005 at the Oval Office. This is, I presume, at a time when George Bush takes over office for the second time. And the third, April 6, 2008 at Sochi in Russia. Now, before I go any deeper, I have to say 2 things here. One, we have to thank people who sought out this information, and that is the Freedom of Information Archive in the US, who went to court demanding this information be declassified. And second, the system in the US which actually did declassify it. I know that people now keep on cursing the deep state, as if the deep state is only an evil thing. Deep states do many things that are evil. The deep state anywhere can also do many things that are evil. But the deep state also is what keeps things going, keeps systems going, gives you continuity, also gives you some rules and conventions which continue to be followed. If there was no deep state, for example, India's own nuclear program, strategic program, would not have had such a smooth progress through years of political instability, through very short-lived coalitions. There was a deep state that was keeping things together. So that is my little tribute to the better part of the deep state, because that brings in continuity and that also brings in following of the conventions and rules, which is why we have these documents. Now we have these documents. We don't have to go into everything that happens between Russia and America is not of our interest immediately. Academics, yes, journalists, not that much. And for all of you, I have to pick out what is most important. So what is most important? As you would expect, are they saying something about Pakistan? Yes, they are saying something about Pakistan and something not very flattering about Pakistan. So that is the one thing we'll talk about. The second thing, they are talking about Russia's own position vis-a-vis the West. And if I take you back to 2001, the first conversation, and this goes on into the 2005 conversation as well, Putin is actually not so averse even to the idea of Russia being admitted to NATO. By 2005 and then definitely in 2008, he's begun to complain big time about Ukraine. Transcending all of this is their joint concern, their shared concern about nuclear proliferation, particularly coming out of Iran. In fact, that is where the Pakistanis also find their first mention, and that mention then continues. This is from the first meeting, June 16, 2001 in Slovenia, where Putin and Bush are expressing their concerns about Iran. And Putin is reassuring Bush by saying that, look, some countries are opening up to Iran. Germany has opened up a credit line for Iran. People are opening it up. Besides, trade in conventional weapons is normal commercial activity. So he's saying trade in conventional weapons is normal commercial activity. Nuclear weapons, however, is a problem. Then Bush has expressed concern that some people on the Iranian side are secretly talking to their Russian counterparts, and he's worried about that. Putin does admit Iranian experts do pose questions about sensitive matters to our experts. There is no doubt they want a nuclear weapon. I've told our people not to tell them such things, and by the way, we will try to work jointly with you in Iraq. This is 2001. Russia and America are trying to get closer. Putin's quite okay with the idea of the US and the Americans working together. And then Putin goes on to say, this is the first mention of Pakistan. And this has come from Putin. Putin says, and I quote, I am concerned about Pakistan. It is just a junta with nuclear weapons, right? It's just a military junta with nuclear weapons. It is no democracy, yet the West makes no criticism of it, should talk about it. So he's admonishing Bush, saying that Pakistan is just a junta with nuclear weapons. They are no democracy. You should be making some criticism about it, but you don't do it. You should be doing it. Bush responds by saying, glad to. You see, the threat is not a United States-Russia clash. What he's trying to do is again to be conciliatory towards Russia and say that threat is not a clash between you and us. The threat is from nuclear proliferation. I'm interpreting that. That comes from Iran, and that's where Pakistan is involved as well. And then at some point, Bush says the Cold War was a time of suspicion, competition, and diminishing each other, to which Putin, with a good sense of humor, says, you did the diminishing part very well. Because Putin carries that big regret about how the Soviet Union got diminished or dissolved. That said, the conversation shifts to Europe, but Putin brings it back. Putin brings it back to Pakistan, and he says, and I quote, this is 2001 June, 9/11 has not happened yet, but Putin says, let me finish with Pakistan and Afghanistan first. Afghanistan is at war. It rocks our boat. Why? Because that is the Islamic underbelly of the Russians, and that is what they worry about. That is what the Soviets used to worry about. The reason they kept Afghanistan as their buffer state after the decline of the British imperial power in the region. So he says it rocks our boat. Osama bin Laden is sitting there. We started to cooperate, but then the leak from the Afghan working group broke last year. So he's saying that he got the Russian and the American agents to work together, and then there was a leak about that working group, that joint working group. I thought it was the work of forces opposed to this sort or any sort of Russian-American cooperation. I lost agents because of that problem. So this is Putin admitting that he lost secret agents because the news about this joint working group leaked out. And then Putin goes on to say, what should we do with Taliban? I asked Clinton, who never gave a straight answer. Now we shift because we are going subject by subject, not chronologically over everything, but with each subject or each issue that we picked up chronologically. Now Pakistan comes up again in the 2005, in the September 16, 2005 conversation. This is taking place in the Oval Office. That's where Putin says it's not clear what the labs have. That's the Iranian labs, because again the mention of Pakistan comes in the context of the Iranian nuclear program, because Bush is concerned that the Iranians are enriching uranium. So Putin says, but it's not clear what the labs have, where they are. Cooperation with Pakistan still exists. That means cooperation of the Iranians with the Pakistanis still exists. And then the conversation goes on. Bush now says, I talked to Musharraf about that. I told him we are worried about transfers to Iran and North Korea. Pakistan has been a big proliferator. Pakistan's been the biggest nuclear proliferator in history. I'm adding that. Bush says, I talked to Musharraf about that. I told him we are worried about transfers to Iran and North Korea. They put AQ Khan in jail and some of his buddies under house arrest. We want to know what they said. I keep reminding Musharraf of that. Either he is getting nothing or he is not being forthcoming. Putin now pipes up and Putin speaks the most significant line in these conversations. After having said Pakistan is just a military junta with nuclear weapons, he now says, as far as I understand, Putin says, as far as I understand, they found uranium of Pakistani origin in these centrifuges, in the Iranian centrifuges. Bush says, yes, the stuff the Iranians forgot to tell the IAEA about, that's a violation because they had Pakistani uranium but did not tell the IAEA about it. Putin says it was of Pakistani origin. That makes me nervous. Now stay with me because I will explain to you what is it that they are so nervous about. Putin says it was of Pakistani origin. That makes me nervous. Bush says it makes us nervous too. Putin says think about us, which means we are in the neighborhood. Bush says we don't need a lot of religious nuts with nuclear weapons. That's what Iran has running their country. At one stage, in fact, in one of the subsequent conversations, Putin puts that in perspective. And Putin says that they may be ideologically driven or they may be crazy in terms of following the ideology that they do in Iran. But they are not nuts. They are not stupid people. They are intellectuals. They are very well educated. They've all been to universities. So he puts that perspective as well, but in a different conversation in this series. To take this conversation forward, to understand why Putin is saying, think about us, we are even more worried than you about this proliferation. We have to go back, leapfrog back to the 2001 conversation. There's Putin is telling George Bush, when the Soviet Union fell apart, dangers appeared on Russia's southern border. Right? That is the Islamic underbelly. Southern border, we face Islamic radicalism. I would have preferred to use Islamist because I make a distinction between Islamic, which is religious, and Islamist, which is political. However, let me not edit Putin. I would not dare to. Let me just use the line he used. We face Islamic radicalism. I needed leverage and could get it no other way. The old leverage was gone. My new friends deserted me. There was no debt reduction. This is when Russia still had severe economic problems. That's the reason he said he went to North Korea. That is what he's trying to explain his visit to North Korea. But in the process, he talks about the threat he faces from Islamic radicalism on his south. And then there is a fascinating aside, which I can't help but not bring to you. Putin says, when I met Henry Kissinger in St. Petersburg, he asked me about my background. Now, Putin, we know, came from KGB. He was a KGB colonel. He said, that is Kissinger said, Putin says, Kissinger said that all decent people got their start in intelligence. I thought this is such a wonderful line that I had to share it with you. Now we come to Iran. Again, we are not starting chronologically. I'm starting with 2008. That is the latest conversation. Bush says, I tell people on Iran, your plan was very ingenious. The leaders say they want civilian nuclear power. We say, fine, that's your right. Russia says, here is the fuel for civilian nuclear power. Therefore, you don't need to enrich, right? If you get nuclear fuel, why do you need to enrich? If you do it, it shows you don't want just nuclear power, civil nuclear power, you want more. People say, can you work with Putin? Bush is speaking. I say, here is the example. He took the lead on Iran and I followed. It was the right thing to do. So 2008, again, Russia and the US are working together. Then Putin speaks out. Putin says, that's what I told them in Iran when they said they were building a nuclear power plant and they needed fuel. I asked, when would they complete the plant? It's a long-term project. We've been building Bushehr. That's a nuclear plant that the Russians have been building in Iran. We've been building Bushehr for 15 years. I said, for you, I said, that is Putin saying, I said you won't complete a new plant for 15 years. So why are you building up enrichment now? Bush then raises the question of Russia selling S-300 surface-to-air missiles to Iran, which eventually they did. However, at this point in September 2008, Putin says, we have a contract signed with them 4 years ago. but not being implemented. Bush says, I appreciate that. They are nutty. To which Putin responds, they are quite nuts. And then Putin goes on, and that's the reference I'd given to you earlier to make perspective clearer. Putin says, what surprised me when I was there, they may be crazy in their ideology, but they are intellectuals. They are educated in university, come from an academic environment, including Ahmadinejad, his entourage, the Speaker of Parliament. They are not primitive people. It was quite a surprise to me. In fact, in another of their conversations, in the 2005 conversation, Putin has said something similar about Israel. That is basically to say that when you are away from a place, you haven't been there, okay, you can sometimes make a picture of the place which is not real, and you can paint the devil on the wall. My line, not Putin's. And he says he had thought Israel would be a very hostile, difficult country, but when he went there, he found that it was quite different. That is the point he's making to Bush about Iran also in this case. As we are leaping back and forth chronologically, I will now leap backwards to 2005, to the 2005 conversation, because some of these things have recently been in our headlines. The Natanz enrichment facility, for example, which was attacked in the last Iran-Israel war, which the Americans also joined in. In the 2005 conversation, Bush says they are testing and probing. That means the Iranians are testing and probing. They are looking for a weak link. Germany seems to be the weakest link in the EU, so they can turn there. Then they turn to Russia. I understand they are the new guy on the block. They have a new government. But it's the same group of unelected mullahs who are making the decisions. He needs to know the parameters he can move around in, or we are going to face a nightmare. So once again, Bush is reaching out to Putin for help in containing the Iranians. Then Bush says the military option stinks. I am sure Trump never read this. Bush says the military option stinks, but we can't take it off the table. Ariel Sharon was then the leader of Israel. Sharon would be thinking about the nuclear option. Iranian nukes really scare the Israelis. Diplomacy must work. That's an important point to keep in mind. If Sharon feels he needs to strike Iran, all hell will break loose. I am not saying it will happen, only that the most likely military reactions will come from Israel. And sure enough, within 20 years, within 19 years, exactly that happened. Israel attacked all of Iran's nuclear facilities. Ultimately, Donald Trump also, haunted by FOMO, fear of missing out, he also joined in. As this conversation goes on, however, Putin says, but what will they target? Maybe Putin is trying to figure out what do the Americans know. Putin says, you are saying Israelis will target Iran, but what will they target? Bush says, if they think there is enrichment at Natanz, that's the one. But we aren't doing the targeting for Israel. President Putin now says, but it's not clear what the labs have, where they are. Cooperation with Pakistan still exists. So whenever you come to Iran and illegal enrichment or illegal development of nuclear weapons, Pakistan invariably features in these conversations. Now we come to the third issue they've picked up here, which is of interest to all of us. That is Russia's view on NATO, Putin's view on NATO, and also starting at a time when Putin thought the idea of Russia joining NATO could not be ruled out. It might actually be a good idea. Now Putin is speaking, and this is in the 2001 conversation, June 16, 2001 in Slovenia. He says, now let me return to NATO enlargement. You know our position. You have made an important statement when you said that Russia is no enemy. What you said about 50 years in the future is important. Russia is European and multi-ethnic, like the United States. So he's comparing Russia with the US. I can imagine us becoming allies. Only dire need could make us allied with others, that is against each other, which is precisely what's happened right now for all practical purposes. Now Russia is allied with the Chinese. And then Putin goes on to say, but we feel left out of NATO. If Russia is not part of this, of course it feels left out. Why is NATO enlargement needed? In 1954, the Soviet Union applied to join NATO. I have the document. He's done his homework before meeting Bush. Bush says, that's interesting. Putin now says NATO gave a negative answer with 4 specific reasons. Back to the list of 4 that Putin is now quoting, that NATO gave for denying Soviet Union admission to NATO in 1954. 1, the lack of an Austrian settlement. 2, the lack of a German settlement. East and West Germany were divided. The lack of a German settlement. 3, the totalitarian grip on Eastern Europe. And 4th, need for Russia to cooperate with the UN disarmament process. Now, all these conditions have been met. Perhaps Russia could be an ally. This was June 2001. 24 years is a long time in history. And finally, our 4th highlight, which is about Ukraine. And Ukraine is the fulcrum on which the new geopolitics is swinging. Ukraine is also the cause, or at least the supposed cause, which has led to this trade rupture between India and the US. Putin says, talking about NATO enlargement and then coming on to Ukraine and giving his own exposition on what he thinks of Ukraine. Now, I'd like to repeat what I said to Condi, that is Condoleezza Rice, and Gates, Robert Gates, Secretary of Defense, in Moscow on NATO enlargement. It won't be new to you, and I don't expect a response. I just want to say it out loud. I'd like to emphasize accession to NATO of a country like Ukraine will create for the long term a field of conflict for you and us, long-term confrontation. This is a warning he's giving in September 2008. Bush says, why? Putin now says 17 million Russians live in Ukraine. That is the Donbass area. 17 million Russians live in Ukraine, a third of the population. Ukraine is a very complex state. This is not a nation built in a natural manner. It's an artificial country created back in the Soviet times. Following World War II, Ukraine obtained territory from Poland, Romania, and Hungary. That's pretty much all of Western Ukraine. In the 1920s and 30s, Ukraine obtained territory from Russia. That is the eastern part of the country. That's when Ukraine has become part of the Soviet Union. It's a republic within the Soviet Union. In 1956, the Crimean Peninsula was transferred to Ukraine within the Soviet system. So within the Soviet system, this region was transferred to the Ukraine Republic, which was a member of the Soviet Republic system. It's a rather large European country built with a population of 45 million. It's populated by people with very different mindsets. If you go to Western Ukraine, you will see villages where the only spoken language is Hungarian and people wear those bonnets, Hungarian bonnets. In the East, people are wearing suits, ties, and big hats. NATO is perceived by a large part of the Ukrainian population as a hostile organization. And then he goes on to say, challenging the logic that Ukraine could join NATO, he says, I don't think it's the right logic. I'm trying to comprehend. And given the divergent views of areas of the population on NATO membership, the country could just split apart. I always said there is a certain pro-Western part in Ukraine, there is a certain pro-Western part, and a certain pro-Russian part. Now, the power there is held by the pro-Western leaders. As soon as they came to power, they split within themselves. And then he goes on to say once again that to take this Ukraine anywhere closer to NATO will trigger a very severe response from the Russians. So nobody can say that Putin had not held out this warning much earlier, very much within time. And you know, in the end, what's happened now? Look at the peace proposal that the US has now put out. If you look at that peace proposal, whatever happens at the end of the day, Putin would have had his wish met. Or his intellectual argument that the eastern side of Ukraine was more Russian in its thinking, had a larger Russian population, and Russia deserves, in his view, deserves to have it as a part of their country, that is Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. It looks like if this peace proposal is finally accepted or some variation of it is accepted, it looks like this wish or demand or intellectual argument that Putin made in this 2008 conversation would have been met. He would have won this argument.